July 15th, 2015, a decade ago as of making this video, Apple released the iPod Touch 6th generation via press release on their website, which was the first full generation of iPod released since 2012. The iPod Touch 6th generation had 3 new key features compared to the 5th generation. First was its new color lineup of product red, pink, gold, blue, silver, and space gray as I have here. The second key feature of the iPod Touch 6th generation is that boasts the A8 chip found on the iPhone 6, which was in the latest iPhone, although the chip on the iPod is underclocked, rather than the iPod Touch 5th generation's A5 processor, also found on the iPhone 4S that is 1 year older. The third new feature was that the iPod Touch 6th generation had an improved 8 megapixel rear camera over the iPod Touch 5th generation's 5 megapixel rear eyesight camera on those with rear cameras. The iPod Touch 6th generation was also the first iPod to boast slow-mo video recording. I will now show the differences between their cameras. The iPod Touch 6th generation initially started at $199 for the 16GB variant, $249 for the 32GB, $299 for 64GB, and at $399 for the 328GB model sold exclusively via Apple. However, the iPod Touch 6th generation did remove the lanyard attachment found on some 5th generations, likely because few people used it on the iPod Touch 5. It's not as controversial as the iPod Touch 6th generation's battery life, though. Even though iPod Touches have always been notorious for poor battery life, even when they are new, the 6th generations was far worse. Liam Revac from Revac Tech had to get his iPod Touch 6th generation replaced over 20 times due to his unit's poor battery lives, and his iPod Touches weren't even his main devices. Furthermore, both Alpha Day Wolf from the Random Alpha Gadgets and Matt from Matt's Tech have iPod Touch 6th generations with expanding batteries that started in 2022. For context, expanding batteries on Apple devices that are only 7 years old and in Alpha Day Wolf's case 5 are very unusual. However, the most controversial aspect of the iPod Touch 6th generation was the fact that it was current when one could easily buy an older iPhone for the same price as an iPod Touch 6, or children could simply receive their parents' old iPhones and simply not activate a cell plan if their parents did not want that. Nonetheless, I still have a few friends that had iPod Touch 6th generations when they were current. In July 2017, Apple discontinued the 16GB and 64GB iPod Touch 6th generation and changed the lineup to where the 32GB model started at $199 and the 128GB variant started at $299. To add to the iPod's demise, Apple also removed the iPod section of their website in July 2015 to the point where potential buyers of any iPod had to visit their music page. Even though the iPod Touch is historically known for being a gaming platform, that changed on September 26, 2017 when the famous mobile version of Fortnite Battle Royale, debuted, which requires 2GB of RAM to play, also known as double the RAM of the iPod Touch 6th generation. On May 28, 2019, Apple discontinued the iPod Touch 6th generation when it was replaced by the iPod Touch 7th generation. In September 2019, Apple dropped the iPod Touch 6th generation for mainstream iOS update support, leaving all units on iOS 12, like this one. However, it kept receiving security updates until January 2023 with the release of iOS 12.5.7. Even though the iPod Touch 6th generation was controversial, it still sold well initially to the point where I know a few people that had them when they were new. I personally didn't have an iPod Touch 6th generation when they were new because I had a 5th generation, which is actually this one right here, and iPads I preferred using. Furthermore, I initially thought Apple changed the color lineup of the iPod Touch 5th generation upon seeing the 6th generation for the first time in 2015. Additionally, the iPod Touch 6th generation was the thinnest iOS device until October 2018 when the 2018 iPad Pro beat it. However, the most significant aspect of the iPod Touch 6th generation was that it was the final iPad to sell well. Collect vintage Apple devices like myself and desire an iPod Touch 6th generation. They typically retail for between $50 and $60, although on eBay, many listings feature cheap Chinese refurbished units, so please be wary of them. If you want to know more about how to spot these suspicious listings for iPods on eBay, ITWI made a great video about that I will link in this video's description. Did you own an iPod Touch 6th generation back when it was current? Please comment that down below. As always, thank you all for watching this video. I'm the iTunes family, and peace out.